I mean, the thing about the kingdom Protista is it's often considered to be like kind of a garbage kingdom. You know, if it doesn't fit anywhere else, then we dump it in this kingdom Protista. You'll notice there's two subkingdoms, and you're not responsible on the sheet. Unfortunately, I didn't put the two subkingdoms. I may have actually written them in there, but it would be a good idea to know the two subkingdoms. I don't think you're actually tested on them, but this is how we take this large, diverse kingdom and break it up into two groups, the protozoa and the algae. The protozoans are animal-like things and the algae are plant-like things. And so let's look at the taxonomy of the protozoa and talk a little bit about their human relevance, and then we'll do the algae. And then at that point, we'll move on to the fungi. And on Wednesday, for the next lecture, we'll do plants and animals, and then we'll basically be done. I'll feel like I have at least told you a little bit about taxonomy. So these groups, the way that we break up the taxonomy of the protozoa, and again, the protozoa, they're all unicellular, and for lack of a better word, animal-like, because they're heterotrophic. They can't make sugar. They can't photosynthesize. We break them up based upon their means of motility. We have the flagellates, which have flagella, the ciliates, which have cilia. The sarcodina are the amoebas, and they move with this weird thing called amoeboid motion. And then we have the apicomplexa, which are non-motile. They don't move. They at very best, they can wiggle a little bit. And this group, these are obligate parasites. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about these organisms and how they're relevant. One of the most important relevant things I can tell you about the flagellates, which are in the Mastigophora, are that many of them, or there are many parasites of humans in this group. And this one you're looking at here is called Giardia lamblia. Let's write that name down. Giardia is the genus. And just to be clear, on the test, you don't need to know genus names. You know, you just need to know the taxonomy on the sheet. So really what you need to know about the Mastigophora is that they're the flagellates, right? That's the big message here. But Giardia is an important parasite of mammals, including humans. And if you are unfortunate enough to get this little booger inside of you, and what you're looking at here, this is actually the dorsal, the top side of this little guy. He's kind of a tear-shaped, microscopic, unicellular animal-like thing. A bunch of flagella here, you can see. Okay, this is actually a bilobed nucleus. This thing is connected like this. Well, if you flip this little booger over on its dorsal side or ventral side, it has a sucking mouth part. And so what Giardia does, if you ingest the eggs or cysts of this organism and it gets in your, passes, the cysts are very resistant and they pass through the stomach, but when they get into your lower intestines, they hatch out and then they begin to parasitize your intestines. They suck nutrients directly from the intestinal wall. And as you could imagine, this is very insulting to your gastrointestinal tract, and you're going to have chronic diarrhea and cyclical chronic diarrhea, nausea as well, perhaps. So here's the crazy thing. About 80% of the human population has been exposed to Giardia at some point. How is this possible? Well, most humans live in populated areas in third world countries, and there's no clean water. And so in many countries, particularly in the third world, as we call it, the first sips of water that an infant takes is likely going to inoculate them. If you're inoculated as a child, you get over it pretty quickly. And then you're a carrier, but you don't really have symptoms. As an adult, if we, go, say, to somewhere in South America or Central America, I mean, you could get Giardia in this country as well. But, typically we're used to drinking clean water. And if you drink water in other countries that's not been treated, you may be susceptible to this parasite. So don't drink surface water. Giardia has been found in every stream in the Great Smoky Mountains, for example. You can't drink surface water safely anymore. There is a treatment for it. It's a drug called metronidazole, which is a very toxic drug, but it does get rid of the parasite.
My best friend went to Africa on a mission trip and she got Giardia.
Oh, that's too bad. I bet that kind of ruined the trip for her.
It was brutal.
Yeah, it can be brutal. So again, you gotta be careful. And in other countries, it's not just the water. They could have washed any sort of green leafy vegetable or any kind of vegetable that could have been washed with polluted water would be another means of transfer. Okay, so if you think that one's bad, well, this is trypanosoma. This is a blood parasite. And so what you're looking at here is kind of wacky, but I'll just show you. All these little sort of pinkish circles are red blood cells. And all of these things are the parasite. And these are literally swimming around in this person's blood. And so this genus is trypanosoma. And again, you don't have to know the genus name. You would just know that Mastagopher are the flagellates. This is the parasite that causes African sleeping sickness in Africa and Chagas disease in South America. And this is not a parasite that you want. This one can kill you untreated and commonly does kill its host. There is treatment, but of course, if you live in a third world country, there's probably not treatment. In South America, the vector for this is the dung beetle. In Africa, it's the mosquito, but in South America, it's the dung beetle. And they'll tell you if you're traveling to certain parts of Argentina or Bolivia or Peru, you want to avoid sleeping in daub and wattle structures, which are structures that are made of cow poop and clay mixed together, because it's a good habitat for this dung beetle. You get bitten by the dung beetle and you end up perhaps with this awful trypanosoma parasite, which causes symptoms very similar to malaria: fever, malaise, etc. Now we get to the Ciliophora. You can see all these cilia on this little thing, and these are the ciliates. And again, means of motility, well, they move by flapping these little hairs on their bodies and moving through the water. Ciliophorans are not known to be parasites. They're free living and they're kind of predatory on smaller organisms in water. And then there's the Sarcodyna, and these are the amoebas. And the amoebas are known to be parasites. Entamoeba histolytica is a Sarcodyna that's a parasite of humans. You'll notice their means of motility. This is called a pseudopod, Pseudopod, or pseudopodia, false foot. And so the way this organism moves is not real fast. It will put out one of these little feet, and then the body of the organism can kind of stream into the foot, and then the organism is effectively moved from there to there, not very fast. But these can infect you if you drink, again, polluted groundwater or polluted water. You get Entamoeba histolytica. It can be a very serious. This one tends to live in the large intestines, and this is where water is reabsorbed from the feces. And so if you get irritation of the large intestines, you're going to have really bad diarrhea. And, you're losing electrolytes, and you can die within 2 or 3 days just from diarrhea, just so you know, especially if you're an infant or elderly. Don't drink surface water or treat it if you have to. And then there's the apicomplexa. And again, this is another blood parasite. This is the group that's an obligate, that are obligate parasites. In other words, they have to live in a host. And what you're looking at in this picture, again, these are red blood cells. This little sickle-shaped thing right here is the parasite, and this is called Plasmodium as the genus. This is the parasite that causes malaria. Crazy thing about malaria, y'all. Malaria as a parasite has killed more humans than all the other parasites put together over the history of humankind. Okay, so break it down. Malaria, from the Spanish is bad air. They used to believe that malaria came from breathing in the swamp vapors. The connection to the swamp was the mosquito, not the vapors, right? And so if you're unfortunate enough to be bitten by a mosquito that's carrying this disease, you can see it has a very complicated life cycle. Just take a look at that. Very complicated life cycle. And again, you're not responsible for this, but just so you can appreciate how complex this parasite is, there's human blood stages, human liver stages, and mosquito stages. And again, if you're bitten by an infected mosquito, it can transmit the protozoan parasite to you. This just means if you're traveling to a malarial area, Central, South America, Africa, Asia, you need to take a anti-malarial drug prophylactically, meaning as a preventative, okay? Otherwise, you don't want to get malaria. Modern science cannot definitively say they can get rid of malaria once you get it. They can definitely put it into remission, but you may still have flare-ups. So it's one to avoid. And the way to avoid, vector transmitted parasite is to avoid the vector. And so how have we controlled malaria in the United States? By controlling the vector, right? We had spray programs. The idea is you kill the vector for long enough for the humans that are infected to die, and then there's no infection pool. And if the vector comes back, it's harmless, okay? All right, then we get to the algae. And the algae, we have all these divisions. I'm not sure that all of these divisions are on your sheet, and that's okay. So just worry about the ones that are on there. I know the green algae and the red algae, and I think the browns are on there. So just refer to the sheet, but we'll just say a few words about each of these. The greens are the most diverse, and I would say the one that you're probably the most familiar with. And just to be clear, we talked about life forms, check it out. There's a unicellular green algae. There's a colonial green algae. There's a filamentous green algae. And this is the one you're probably the most familiar with, which is thallic, Thallic. That's the life form, and it's a flat sheet of cells. And this is called ulva or sea lettuce. And so if you ever look on piers or pilings at the beach, when the tide goes out, you may have seen this. You may have also seen it just floating in the water. Okay. And, ulva is, or the green algae, the chlorophyta in general, are very important parts of our marine ecosystem. And also in freshwater, they're found. The browns are, the phaeophyta are the brown algae. They are commonly called the kelps. And these include the largest algae. Sea kelp, giant kelp, can be 120 feet tall. This gives you an idea of the size of the kelps. And as far as human relevance goes, they are edible and we eat them. If you are a fan of sushi, then every time you eat the nori wrapper on the sushi, you're eating kelp. Or if you eat the seaweed salad, that is also a type of brown algae. Okay. So this stuff is harvested, dried, processed, and then used as food. I don't think the reds are on your list, but we'll just very briefly, they're called the red algae. They contain this pigment called phycobilin, which is a red pigment. It allows them to photosynthesize in very deep, dark water, so in very low light. And the most important thing I can tell you about the reds is they're a commercial source of this stuff called carrageenan. Now, if you're a food label reader, you've seen this as a food ingredient in things like milk products that aren't made from dairy, like soy milk or rice milk, ice cream. It's used as a thickening agent and also an emulsifier, meaning it keeps the different ingredients mixed together. Okay, so there's that. And there's a picture of the reds. They're really pretty. They're also commonly called seaweeds. Now we get to the diatoms. They are unicellular, and they're just like a little unicellular photosynthetic. It's like a flagellate organism. It has flagella and it swims around, but it has a shell made of glass. And so they actually blow this glass or silica into a shell, and they live inside of the shell. And these are some of the most beautiful microscopic images you're ever going to see. They often have electron microscopy contests, and you can see see the copyright in this one. So this is a very famous photo. These are just the shells of the diatoms. So chrysophyta are the diatoms. They are at the bottom of the food chain in marine ecosystems and in freshwater ecosystems, and that makes them extremely important. And they also photosynthesize. It turns out that the algae make most of the oxygen that's liberated on Earth. And so we have this situation where we always talk about plants being great because they make oxygen, but most of the oxygen is actually made by algae in the ocean. And the diatoms are some of the most important ones. Okay, moving right along. Now we get to sort of the black sheep of the kingdom, of the subkingdom algae with the pyrophyta. Pyro means fire. These are the fire algae, or the dinoflagellates. They look very similar to diatoms. Why they're relevant is because they cause red tides. So it turns out that the waste products of these organisms are very toxic. And when there's an abnormal bloom of them, in other words, when the dinoflagellates reproduce uncontrollably, we have a red tide event. And as you may know, red tides kill everything. They kill invertebrates all the way up to mammals, whales, porpoises, dolphins, sharks, bony fish, you name it, including humans. Okay, so humans have died from the toxins of one in particular called Pfiesteria. So, you know, just very quickly, it's almost always due to a point source of nitrogen pollution, and that means humans have probably produced that nitrogen. Raising animals in an unnatural setting like pig farms, poultry farms, golf courses using synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, or fertilizer used in agriculture are usually the culprits for red tides. There's a picture of a picture and some drawings of dinoflagellates. Again, they're unicellular. And then the last group is not on your list. So that's the quick and dirty on the kingdom Protista. You can see there are heterotrophic animal-like things and autotrophic animal or plant-like things. And the heterotrophic ones we break up based upon their means of motility, and then the autotrophic ones are the algae. So now that was good. We made it through that in 22 minutes. Now we're going to jump into the fungi. We'll talk a little more about the fungi because they are fascinating organisms. So for the kingdom matching, like I told you, there will be a kingdom matching on the test, and you know, we're going to add a few words to this for the fungi. I think we already did this actually when we went through the sheet, but they're eukaryotic, they're exclusively heterotrophic. Filamentous, spore producing, and non-motile would be two other words you could add. Okay. And here's the taxonomy that you're responsible for. The zygomycota are the molds and mildews, everyone's favorite fungi. No, the ascomycota are the cup fungi and the yeasts. We'll talk about those a lot. Psidiomycota are the group that you're most familiar with when you think of fungi, including things like mushrooms and what's so-called toadstools. Shelf fungi, stinkhorns, puffballs. There should be a comma right here between puffball and earth star. And then the Deuteromycota we call the imperfect fungi, or the fungi imperfecti. Turns out these groups are based upon sexual reproductive structures that are produced, and we won't worry about the names of those. But this last group is kind of like a garbage group where we don't know because we've never seen them have sex for some reason, probably because they're so good at asexual reproduction. This group doesn't do sexual reproduction. They just do asexual. So here's the first one. You're all familiar with it. You cannot tell me you've never seen this before, because you have. And this is called, and again, you don't need to know genus names, but I give it to you just for clarity. This is called Rhizopus, black bread mold. And we call it black bread mold, but it will grow on any carbohydrate source. And you can see the white filaments are growing, and then all the black is the spores. And so the lots of spores being produced. It's all asexual. Mitosis makes the spores. And Rhizopus, why is it relevant? It is an agent of spoilage. It rots your food. How many loaves of bread have you thrown away? A lot, right? Times all the other humans on the earth that have thrown away moldy bread. It is a contaminant of sterile culture. That is a big deal. There are sterile labs all over the world, and when this thing gets in them, it contaminates them. Then it's big money to clean it up. They are known allergens. So the spores, many people are allergic to them. And it's toxic if you eat it. So don't eat moldy bread. It's toxic. It's not good for you, particularly black mold. Any kind of white and black mold, avoid it like the plague. It's not good for you. Okay. Here's a picture of it growing on a Petri. This is actually growing on a piece of bread. I took a piece of bread from Earth Fair and I soaked it in moistened it up a little bit, and then I just left it out. And this took about 8 days. And so, when it's warm and humid, this stuff grows really, really fast. Black bread mold. Another member of the Zygomycota, the molds and mildews, is this one called shotgun fungus, which is very cool. And if you want to learn a little more about the shotgun fungus, you can watch the longer YouTube video on the Basidia, on the Zygomycota that's on YouTube. Some of you may have already watched it. Okay. But suffice it to say, this thing launches these, they call it shotgun fungus because it launches these sporangia, these sacs full of spores, through the air. This is a dung fungus. It typically grows in cow poop. And we get to the Ascomycota, a fascinating group. It includes important edibles, and we'll talk about the ergot fungus and then many plant pathogens. Remember, fungi can be pathogenic to plants and kill them. And some of the most important ones were the one that caused the Irish potato famine, Dutch elm disease, and chestnut blight. And so a lot to talk about with the Ascomycota. Or the Ascomycota include the cup fungi and the yeasts. And so, around here, this is probably one of our most important edible fungi, certainly one of the most valuable. And this is Morchella esculenta. Esculenta means delicious. Or succulent. And these are the morels. These are yellow morels. We also have black morels here. These come up in the spring for about 3 or 4 week period, typically in hardwood forests. They are notoriously tricky to find, and people are obsessed with them, and they spend hours and hours and hours wandering around looking for them. As far as their value, they're fetching about $150 a half pound, about $200 to $300 a pound, which is a lot, that would be the retail price, okay, if you can find them. So keep an eye out for them. This is considered one of the safer ones that you can look for and collect and eat. We'll talk more about wild crafting fungi. And this is the truffle. Now, truffles, the United States is not known for truffles. Usually the truffle is known from Europe primarily. And these are the most valuable fungi on Earth in terms of edible species. How valuable are they? Black French or Italian black truffles fetch $500 an ounce, not a pound, an ounce. So they're extremely valuable. Traditionally, pigs were used to look for the truffles. And what you're seeing here are the fruiting bodies. These are full of spores on the inside. And the weird thing about the truffle is it makes its fruiting body buried in the ground like this. And so it needs a way to get those spores into the air. And what better way than to attract a pig? And so scientists were really curious, why in the world are these pigs so attracted to these truffles? Well, it turns out that the truffle makes a chemical that it releases into the air that's a pheromone. A pheromone is a chemical attractant. And that pheromone that it produces is almost identical to the pig pheromone when the female pig goes into heat. So it's kind of like when your dog or your cat goes in heat, all the male dogs show up. Well, these male pigs think they're going to get something, but it turns out it's just a little mushroom and a little fungus in the ground. Pigs are big animals, and although they're really good at sniffing out truffles, humans that collect them realize that there's an easier answer, and that is to just train dogs. You can train a dog to sniff whatever. And so there are truffle dogs. They train them to sniff truffles, and the dog's a little easier to manage in the woods. You just give it a doggy treat when it finds the truffle. Okay. What do they taste like? It's funny. People have a love-hate relationship with them. They're very garlicky, body odory kind of smell, and they're very strong. A tiny little bit of one is very strong. Okay, so. You may or may not like it. You've probably had truffle oil at some point if you've eaten some fine dining. It's infused. Usually they'll infuse olive oil with truffles. They also do truffle chocolates and truffle honey and you name it. Okay. So we're in the Ascomycota. We have these important edibles. Why do they call them cup fungi? Well, a lot of them make these little cups like this. And you may have seen one similar to this one in the woods, especially in the late winter, early spring. It's bright red and it grows a lot on birch twigs that have fallen to the ground. And this is called Pisiza. Now, this one is worth talking about. Still in the Ascomycota, cup fungi and yeasts. This species is Claviceps purpurea, aka the ergot fungus. And let's just take a look at what we're seeing here, because this is just fascinating. Oops, there we go. So what you're looking at is grain, and you could imagine this is a head of wheat, right? Think about a wheat penny. And there's the little awn, and there's little kernels of wheat in here. Well, if you look closely, you can see these black things here. This is the fungus. And ergot, Claviceps is a parasite of grain. And so what has happened here is a spore has landed on one of these kernels. It's a rich carbohydrate source. The spore germinates, it grows, it eats the kernel, and it creates this fruiting body that's full of spores like this over time. Well, although the Claviceps fungus is a parasite of grain, it is also toxic to mammals, and it causes a disease called ergotism. It's toxic to the liver and kidneys. And so you could imagine, if your liver and your kidneys aren't working, you're going to feel like crap, y'all. I mean, your liver and your kidneys filter the blood, your blood's toxic, you're going to be tired, nauseated. But in addition to that, there are chemical alkaloids in the Claviceps and the ergot fungus that cause psychological manifestations. It's psychoactive. So it can cause hallucinations. And over time, if you continue to ingest the ergot fungus, it can literally lead to this sort of paranoid schizophrenic state. We believe that some historical events might have been fueled by the ergot, most notably is the Salem witch trials. And so, what we believe is that these people in Salem, Massachusetts were all infected with ergot poisoning, and they were seeing and hearing things that just weren't real. And what they did was they kind of singled out people that were on the fringes of the culture and accused them of being witches and casting spells upon them. That was how they were trying to explain their physical illness. And they rounded these people up and they had these trials, and the trials were crazy, y'all. It's like you could deny being a witch and they would kill you because you were a liar, or you could admit being a witch and they would still kill you, but then they would allow you to make your peace with God before they did. That was the trial. what's the evidence that ergot was involved? They've actually exhumed bodies from this time period and found very high concentrations of ergot in the bones of these people. And so we know they were suffering from ergotism. Once humans realized that the ergot was toxic, they were careful to remove that from the grain before they ground it into flour. And then these events stopped happening at the frequency that they were before. This same scenario plays out all over Europe as well. St. Elmo's fire. Okay. So commercial grain is not, you don't really have to worry too much about it these days. And hey, guess what? That's not the end of the story for the ergot, because fast forward to the 1950s, 1940s really, late 1940s. And this guy, Albert Hofmann, Albert Hofmann is the most renowned chemist. He's an alkaloid chemist. He's the most renowned alkaloid chemist in the world in the 1940s. What Albert Hofmann is able to do, he's able to take a plant, or in this case, a fungus, and separate all the different chemical alkaloids out. Well, Albert Hofmann was hired by a Dutch pharmaceutical company to study the ergot fungus. They were looking for something that would act as a brake on the heart, slow down the heart. And they believed that there might be some promise in the ergot with some of these chemicals. This is the advent of heart surgery. They're starting to tinker with people's hearts. Well, Albert Hofmann begins doing his job and separating out all these different chemical alkaloids that he's finding in the ergot. And he finds one class of chemical alkaloids called the lysergic acids. And being a chemist, you know, he could have just found these chemicals and left them alone, but he starts messing with them. He starts attaching functional groups. He starts attaching a diethyl amide group. I don't know why he chose that group. He starts attaching it to different locations on the lysergic acid. And he does 31 different versions of this molecule. And one day he's walking across his laboratory with the 25th version, LSD 25. And Albert is a notably clumsy man, and he kind of stumbles and trips a little bit, and he spills some of this liquid onto his skin. And he later noted he had this profound psychological effect from this, for what he believed was this chemical. And so for about 6 months, he wants to give it to someone to ingest, but because he's pretty sure that's what the chemical is that's accounting for the psychoactive property of the ergot. But he didn't know what it will do. He's afraid it might kill them. And so he finally decides to be the guinea pig. And Albert Hofmann takes what for most drugs would be a small amount. He takes about 20 milligrams of pure LSD. Now, just so you know, we measure doses of LSD in micrograms, UG, and 20 micrograms, 20 thousandths of a gram, or 20 thousandths of a milligram rather, would be considered a dose of LSD. So in his laboratory on this fateful day, Albert Hofmann takes the equivalent of thousands of hits of LSD all at once. And his goal is to journal. He's going to journal every 15 minutes. Well, he makes it not but about an hour before he just can't do it anymore. He starts freaking out, as you could imagine. He gets on his bicycle and tries to ride back to his apartment, but he doesn't make it. He falls on the sidewalk, and he's laying on the sidewalk, and people are gawking at him, and they're like, Albert Hofmann is drunk at 11:30 a.m. What's going on? Some friends find him. They get him back to his apartment, and he rides out this tremendous acid trip. He's the first human to ever take acid, right? So, it's hard to deny that this discovery didn't change human culture, because later we had the 60s, and lots of people were dropping acid, and people do still use LSD as a recreational drug. Some things about LSD and other chemicals that we'll talk about: they are serotonin analogs, meaning your body can't tell them from serotonin, which is a brain neurotransmitter. Some other serotonin analogs are psilocybin, which is in another mushroom in the genus psilocybe. Peyote has mescaline, which is one, and then DMT, dimethyltryptamine, is another. So these are all psychoactive drugs that sort of overload the brain with mock neurotransmitter. Okay. As far as LSD goes, it is illegal. That's something worth mentioning. It is a scheduled drug. It is completely water soluble, meaning 48 hours, really 24 to 48 hours after ingesting LSD, it is undetectable in the body. Compare that to marijuana. If you smoke a joint, 6 months later, they can pluck a hair follicle out of your head. They, I guess, always like to say being the man or whoever wants to know. And they can still find THC in your system. Not so with LSD. So, there's some interesting ethnobotany for you all around this one fungus, Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus. Albert Hoffman, by the way, lived to be 102 years old. And on his 100th birthday, of course, they had to ask, well, do you attribute your longevity to all that LSD you ate? And he didn't care to comment on that. Just very quickly, because we're running, we got about 10 more minutes. If you are of Irish descent and you are in the United States, there's a pretty good chance you're in the United States because of this fungus called Phytophthora infestans, which is the fungus which caused the Irish potato famine. Ireland used the potato to grow their population threefold in 100 years. They went from 2 million people, from 3 million people to 9 million people in 100 years, just because of the potato providing them with a source of nutrients to get through the Irish winter, right? The Irish potato, just so you know, is not native to Ireland. It's native to South America, but it was brought there first to France and then to Ireland. Well, in the 1800s, the 1840s, there was a particularly cold, wet summer in Ireland, and they harvested the potatoes and they all rotted. And subsequently, we had the Irish potato famine. We had 9 million people depending upon one staple crop to survive. And they didn't survive. 3 million people died. Another 3 million left. And where did they go? Most of them came to Canada and the United States, start a new life. So we still have this fungus. It causes late blight in tomato. And if you've grown tomatoes in Western North Carolina, you've seen this. And it also causes potato blight. So, important piece of history there. And then we had the American chestnut blight, where we brought a fungus from Japan or China into the United States on some Chinese chestnut trees. And it spread to the American chestnuts and killed them all. So we've lost this very important species in our flora due to this fungus that was introduced, Cryptonectria parasitica. Okay, now we get to the Basidiomycota. This is the group we're going to blow through pretty quickly. This is a group of organisms that you're more familiar with as far as the fungi go. These are the things you would think of. Many poisonous and edible species, psychoactive species, and some group names for the matching would be mushrooms, puffballs, shell fungi, stinkhorns, and coral fungi. And right away we have Amanita verosa. Verosa means fierce and Amanita means angel. This is the death cap or death angel. This is the most deadly species on earth of fungi. It contains cyclic polypeptides, which just to give you an idea, 2 grams wet weight is the LD50. The LD50 is the lethal dose half the time. So if you eat 4 grams of this, think about like the tip of your thumb, then there's really nothing modern science can do to save you. Short of a liver and a kidney transplant, you're gonna die. So what's the take-home message? Don't put stuff in your mouth you don't know what it is, right? It's the single greatest source of mushroom fatalities in the US, not mushroom poisonings, but mushroom fatalities. Just a little bit about the genus Amanita. It has a vulva, the swollen base, and a universal veil, this little flap of tissue on the stem, and that puts it in the genus Amanita. So avoid eating things unless you are 100% sure you know what they are. Could be fatal. This one is interesting. The fly agaric is actually has its origins of Santa Claus, believe it or not. Santa was a super shaman, and this was the bread. This was the sacrament of the Laplanders that lived in Siberia back in the day. Santa Claus predates Christianity, or Christmas, we might say, predates Christianity by 2,500 years and goes back to the religion of these Laplanders. And part of their religion was this mushroom, which was their sacred mushroom. It's a psychoactive species. This is not psilocybin mushroom, which makes you giggle. If you want to get, you really got to want to get high if you're going to eat this thing. The first hour or two, you're going to be in a semi-comatose state, probably drooling on yourself. Okay, so this is serious business. They realized, the Laplanders, that it was toxic to them to eat. And so what they would do is feed it to the reindeer, and then the reindeer would urinate and pass the psychoactive chemicals out, and then they would just eat the yellow snow, and that's how they would get high off this mushroom. Hence, flying reindeer, right? You ever wondered about flying reindeer? Well, ever wondered about Santa's outfit, you know, the red coat with the white trim? Well, now you know, okay? So, Amanita muscaria is not regulated because there's just not enough people that are willing to indulge in it, okay? And we have a yellow or orange capped variety. We don't have this bright red capped variety around here very often. Santa's a super shaman, y'all. And then, you know, shelf fungi. This is sulfur shelf, which is a polypore shelf fungus that's edible, commonly called chicken of the woods. It's a good example of what we call a partial, meaning 99% of the human population can eat this, and they enjoy it and it doesn't bother them. And then there's the 1% of the population, which I unfortunately am in, that eats the same species and pukes their guts out. So if you're eating wild fungi that you've collected for the first time, eat a tiny little bit, well cooked, wait an hour, make sure you're not going to react to it negatively before you scarf down a bowl, okay? Psilocybe. Spelled incorrectly, that should be an I. Psilocybe is the genus of the magic mushroom, right? And so this is Psilocybe cubensis, which is the so-called liberty cap, when these are the ones, you know, that people consume to get high. It has psilocybin in it, which is similar to LSD, another water-soluble serotonin analog. These are scheduled drugs. You can buy and sell the spores because there's no psilocybin in them. As soon as you shoot those spores into a nutrient medium and they germinate and start to grow, even before they've made mushrooms, you're breaking the law because there's psilocybin in the fungal filaments that are growing. Okay. I would also point out that there are other species, most notably Psilocybe senescens, which is 100 times stronger than this one. And senescens is starting to be cultivated more often. And so now the ER, the emergency room, is seeing cases where people bought a bag of magic mushrooms from their local drug dealer, and they thought they were buying this species, but they actually bought a different species that's 100 times stronger. And, you know, so they eat their normal dose and they end up eating 100 times their normal dose. You got to be careful. The stinkhorns of the genus Phallus, and you could imagine why they call it phallus, because they're very phallic when they come out of the ground. They smell like rotten meat. They're horrible to smell. You'll smell them before you see them. And the strategy here is to attract flies, and this is a sticky mass of spores. And so rather than being airborne, they get stuck to the legs of flies and other insects, and then the insects carry them off. The giant puffballs, these are all in the Basidia mycota, are edible, but I don't know why you'd want to eat one. That's just my personal opinion. One of these giant puffballs can have 30 to 60 trillion spores in it. And if you do the math, if every one of those made one puffball this size, it would be half the mass of the earth. So luckily, most of those spores land in a place where they can't grow, right? Now, the last group, the Deuteromycota, includes Penicillium, and that's the one that I would have you to match on the test. And Aspergillus is another species. Why is Penicillium relevant? You've all seen it. You can't tell me you've never seen this blue-green fungus growing on citrus fruit or bread or cheese. It is relatively harmless aside from being an allergen. So unlike the black and white mold, you can probably wipe the blue mold off cheese and still eat the cheese. In fact, blue cheese is made by purposefully infecting it with a Penicillium species called Penicillium roquefortii, Roquefort cheese. Okay, here it is growing on a Petri plate. Why is it important? Well, it was the source of the first antibiotic. Alexander Fleming discovered that it had a effect on bacteria and realized that it was a it must be producing some chemical that was killing bacteria is what he discovered. And hence the first antibiotic, which has been a game changer for humans, right? Since that time, we've abused antibiotics, both in their prescription and their use. And because of that, now we have mutant strains of bacteria that no known antibiotic will cure. And then here's kind of the bad Deuteromycete. This is Aspergillus. It's black and white, looks similar to the Rhizopus we saw before, but it's actually in the Deuteromycota. Remember, this group doesn't do sexual reproduction. This is all asexual mitosis, if you will. This one can cause aspergillosis, which is a disease of humans where it can actually start to grow in your sinuses or your lungs and create this fungal ball, which is not something you want. Okay. So avoid the aspergillus, okay? It is a common allergen. It's in the air, it's everywhere. Just to tell you, the mold police that want to come in your house and put a Petri plate out for a day, of course, there's gonna be lots of mold growing on it when they bring it back to show you. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a mold problem, but there are limits, you know, safe limits to the amount of mold inside your house. But just to be clear, everyone's going to have Aspergillus, Rhizopus, Penicillium spores in their house. So there's really no way to get rid of them. Okay. So that's the quick and dirty, y'all, on the kingdom Protista and the kingdom fungi. I will tell you, for the kingdom fungi, I would expect you to be able to tell me some important facts about them. We talked about lots of stuff, right? You should be able to write a paragraph just from what we talked about today. Stick with the program. We're winding it down. We'll get our test 4 done pretty soon. And then we have about 3 more lectures, 3 more hours of material, and we are done. Okay.